My sister laughed at my dress. She said it looked like it came from a garage sale. She said it out loud at a family brunch with her voice high and clean, and everyone in the room tuned like a radio. She named the store. She told the story of how she once rescued a dress like that from a charity rack and sold it to a client for triple the price. She circled the hem with one manicured finger, and I felt a small, hot ripple of shame that I couldn't hold back. She did it in front of my nephew. She did it in front of our mother. She did it after the checkmate smile she'd been practicing for years, the one that never reached her eyes but always killed a conversation. It hurt because it wasn't about fashion. It hurt because she was the one person who knew what I had given up to be wearing that dress. She knew I had a mortgage. She knew I'd taken a job on nights, set work, costuming, split shifts, because the company where she worked as a senior project manager controlled the family trust account. She knew I still carried our mother's old car payments on my credit because our mother had trusted her to refile the titles and never did. The laugh was the final move in a pattern she had been practicing for years. Take a private weakness and make it public, then stand aside to watch the damage. I tell this story starting there because the laugh is the one image that lines the rest of it. It's the first clear cut. After that, everything else read as follow through. We grew up with different expectations. I was the one who stayed late with the knitting needles and the PTA forms, the one who chose a steady paycheck in a small city costume shop so I could be around when Mom needed me. She left. She moved to Los Angeles at 26, married a man with connections, and turned sharpness into currency. She learned reputations the way some people collect art. People in our town called her lucky. I called the loan paperwork that had my mother's name on it arranged. She was good at appearing generous. She funded a scholarship, took on unpaid volunteer roles that put her photos on glossy charity brochures. She sent boxes at Christmas with designer labels in them. She is not the sort of person who would confess. She'll pivot instead to a wider circle of attention and let the original slight look small in comparison. We were dependent on each other in practical ways. When our father died 2 years before, the house stayed in probate because our mother misfiled a tax form. The lawyers charged hourly. My hours at the theatre were irregular. My paychecks came late. She offered to help. She offered, and then she became the one who controlled the calendar for repairs, who decided which bills to pay, who decided that our mother's dental care could wait a few months because she said there was a better investment to make if we wanted financial breathing room. She arranged payments through accounts I couldn't access. She told me not to worry about it. She told me firmly. It was not one betrayal. It was a steady, daily erosion. She rewired the household so that every time I pushed for something, clarity about the tax forms, proof of where money had gone, receipts for the sale of an old car, she recommended patience or she called in favors. When I persisted, she described me as dramatic. When I slipped and echoed that description out loud, she smiled the small public smile that meant the discussion was resolved. The first formal escalation was subtle, a changed password on the joint utility account that she controlled. I called the company. They sent me a paper letter addressed to her with a new automatic payment plan that listed her as the primary holder of the house account. "You did this?" I asked her over the phone. She said, I thought it was easier this way, and the tone was a lesson. Consequence, I stopped receiving statements. The situation became more precarious. A notice came months later that the city was putting a lien on the property for a late storm water fee. She shrugged and told me she would take care of it. She did not. The next wave of escalation came when she began excluding me from decisions that had always been shared. She began inviting other family members to meetings with the real estate agent and not telling me. She began appearing at community fundraisers as our mother's representative and not mentioning that I lived in the house. Behind closed doors, she would sign documents as power of attorney and smile at the notary like she was doing me a favor. Every omission was another small theft of agency. My reaction was to confront her directly once in the kitchen under the fluorescent light that flickered in the corner. I need copies of everything you sign, I said. I need to know what you do with the accounts. She looked at me over her coffee and said, "You don't understand how these things work. You never have. I'm handling it so you don't have to worry." The implications suffered me. The consequence was immediate. I felt ashamed for asking. I folded the letter I had printed into the back of a cookbook and left it there for 6 months because the kitchen was her territory and I had learned not to leave things out. After that came a humiliation that had nothing to do with the house. I was up for a small role, a day player's part on a show, something that would put me on set and maybe make the occasional extra job easier to come by. I wore the thrift dress because that was what the costume department cleared for the minor scene. My sister, who knew people in the same industry, learned about the small role and commented on it at a luncheon she hosted. She stood at the edge of the room and told everyone about my little side gigs and emphasized the thrift dress story, the garage sale line, the rescue line, as if she were telling a joke. People laughed politely. The director of a different series happened to be there. He made a point of mentioning later in a private message to her that he appreciated the dicey honesty of the description. My reaction was to avoid that group. The consequence was quiet but efficient. One producer who had been considering me for an assistant position at a higher level assumed I was not serious enough and passed. The situation got worse when mutual acquaintances began to treat me like a cautionary footnote in my sister's biography, a side story to her savvy. She weaponized the family's money against me in another way. She controlled the household credit cards and began a pattern of charging maintenance work to the household and then reimbursing herself through private accounts. When I questioned a specific charge, an expensive designer consultation she claimed to have paid for to keep the house's value high. "You know," she said sharply, "you don't need to worry about the house value. Worry about paying your mortgage on time." Her tone was a hinge. The consequence? My accounts began to drift into overdraft. The bank sent warnings. I paid late fees. The situation was mathematical. Interest compounded, and every late payment abstracted another sliver of my credit. She moved into the third wave of escalation by turning people I trusted against me. My mother's primary care nurse grew close to my sister because they shared a kitchen table recipe habit. My sister would call the nurse and mention my irresponsible spending casually, leaving out that she directed me to pay for repairs from my account while transferring funds into a trust she controlled. The nurse began to treat me like a daughter who shouldn't be trusted with the complex stuff. My reaction was to insist on being included in appointments. The consequence was that the nurse started scheduling visits on days she knew I wouldn't be able to go because of work. The situation deteriorated into a strange isolation. I was doing the physical work of care, but being kept at a legal and social distance. A rumor began to circulate about the estate. It came from an unexpected place, a neighbor who'd been friendly with both of us since childhood. "You know," she said to me at the grocery store, "I heard there was a new will, that your sister made some changes when Dad passed." The rumor was a pressure. I asked for proof. She had none. My sister smiled when I told her. "We finalized everything. You're just worrying over nothing." The new rumor became leverage because other people began to assume there was nothing for me to fight for. The consequence was that my sister's narrative became the dominant one. The situation worsened as people stopped asking me questions and began asking her. Then came the humiliation at my mother's birthday, 6 months after the laugh at brunch. My sister invited half the town and chose a restaurant that had a strict dress code. I wore the dress because it was the dress I had, and because the costume shop had given me the night off with the promise of a small stipend. At the table, she leaned close enough for me to hear. "You wearing vintage is brave," she said, and her voice had a certain performative patina. She told a story about how she once educated a designer client about not cutting corners. She had the room attentive, and then she finished by noting, "Not everyone can pull off thrift." My reaction was fury and coldness. I cut my portion of cake and left. The consequence was not immediate legal action or fireworks. It was social. My mother's friends, who had previously been warm to me, started to be colder. They asked me about my plans, not because they cared, but because they wanted to confirm the narrative that I had no plan. The situation worsened because my sister used the coldness as an argument to our mother, suggesting, "See, people are worried about you living with someone who might not have their affairs in order." It is worth saying, plainly, that the escalation had a method. She moved from mockery to exclusion to legal maneuvering to control of the family's reputation. She did not break one law in a dramatic way. She was patient. She used the arbitrary power of social standing and the slow accretion of small mechanical decisions to make it difficult for me to act. Each new slight made the next one easier. I tried to build leverage the only way I could. I counted receipts that weren't mine. I photocopied old mortgage documents. And I dug through a shoebox of cancelled checks because that was where my mother had been keeping a record. I called an attorney once, and the woman who answered asked for a retainer I couldn't afford. I pushed through that shame and scraped enough to get a consultation. The attorney's response was clinical. "You need evidence, you need documentation. If you have a trustee making decisions, we can subpoena those records." The step from consultation to action required money I didn't have. The low point came on a damp November morning when a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door. It was not to evict me in the theatrical sense. It was to deliver a notice that a mechanic's lien had been filed against the house for work I had never authorized. The letter had my mother's name, my sister's signature, and a timeline of unpaid invoices. My reaction was immediate and animal. I called my sister. She said, "I thought you were taking care of it." She sounded genuinely surprised, but the surprise felt practiced. I stood in the empty living room and the house felt like glass. The low point was exact. I realized I had very little leverage left. Our mother's health was unstable. My work was inconsistent. The accounts were opaque. If a lien could attach, then the title could be challenged. and all the small private spaces where I'd stored family photos and typed the letters that mattered could be lost. I felt trapped. Abandoned is the soft word. The sharper word is dislocated. The things that had been steady, the house, the name on the mail, were moving away from my hands. In that emptiness, a small thing shifted. It was not an epiphany, and it was an accident, a misaddressed email. My sister had been using a shared calendar for the estate repairs and finances. She had a habit of copying her assistant on certain invoices and receipts. One morning, a message landed in my inbox. It was the assistant's reply to a vendor asking for confirmation of a payment. The reply was blunt and contained an attachment. It wasn't meant for me, but there it was. A PDF of a bank transfer with an account number that didn't match the trust account our mother had discussed with me. The number belonged to a private LLC my sister had quietly registered 2 years earlier. The document changed the dynamic because it was not an interpretation. It was a paper trail. It said, in numbers, that funds we all assumed were being applied to the house had been routed elsewhere. There was no theatrical revelation. There was only a cold ledger and a timestamp. That timestamp was everything. It showed that certain repairs were paid to vendors, but that the vendors had been paid by an account that didn't belong to the estate. I printed it and sat at the kitchen table. I told myself to breathe. The turning point was neither grand nor public. It was a small procedural thing. I called the attorney again, and this time I'd saved 3 weeks of overtime checks and a little cash. I walked into the office and slid the printout across the table. We did not file a lawsuit that day. We started with a demand letter. It was less dramatic than it sounds. The attorney's voice was steady when she said, "We will ask for account statements. We'll file for an accounting. There is a process." The consequence of that simple legal step was to pull a curtain back. Within a week, there were more documents. The assistant's inbox turned into a river of forwarded receipts and contradicted statements. The bank responded to the attorney's subpoena with copies of transfers. My sister's explanation, when it came, was that she had been streamlining and protecting family assets. Her tone was not unfamiliar. It was the same tone she used when she told people to be patient. But the numbers were plain. The accounting showed that she had transferred funds into the LLC while listing them in the household ledger under repairs, improvements, and trust management. People asked me why I waited. The answer is that I didn't see the misdirection as theft until it became theft. The turning point was a paper with an account number in plain sight. It shifted the power because I could now ask for returns, for proper accounting, for a trustee to be appointed. The situation was still messy. It required papers, motions, and money. It required mental energy I could barely scrape together between night shifts. But the truth is that having a document changed the conversation. It required my sister to respond in more than stories. Her response escalated again, but this time it had to be defensive. She began to call family meetings in which she performed outrage at the suggestion she had misallocated funds. She sent me messages at odd hours accusing me of trying to ruin everything, and she began to claim that I had been secretly meddling with her accounts. She played the victim the way a trained actor generates sympathy, specifics, tears at the right moment, a carefully curated list of sacrifices she'd made for the family. The consequence of her defense was that friends and neighbors who were sympathetic became uncertain. The situation had become a messy public quarrel where the two sides had enough grain of truth to confuse people. The legal process, however, continued to do its work. The subpoena produced bank statements that matched the assistant's misaddressed email. The bank froze certain transfers pending inquiry. My sister, sensing the risk, tried to transfer funds out of the LLC. The bank refused. She became more frantic. She called our mother daily and told her I was wrong, that I was making a scene. She attempted to secure a private mediator who had cozy ties to her circle. The mediator suggested a quiet buyout. She offered to buy me out of my stake in the house for less than I owed on the mortgage. I refused. The escalation loops kept returning, but each time the ground moved in my favor. The documents removed the fog. The consequence was not instant riches or public shaming. It was a slow reallocation of power. My sister could still smear me socially. She could still make snide comments at gatherings, but she could not, in the cold morning light of bank records, claim that the funds had been used solely for the estate. There were transfers into events, into consulting fees, into a workshop she had set up under the LLC's name. The legal framework required an answer. The situation had become a negotiation. The payoffs were practical. We reached a mediated agreement that reassigned certain debts and required her to return specific sums to the estate account. She would not be stripped of guardianship of our mother's affairs, but the trust would be restructured and a neutral trustee appointed. The consequences were not theatrical. She kept some control. I received a modest settlement that covered the liens and late fees and left enough to restore the household accounts to something stable. I hired, finally, a part-time accountant to keep the records clean. We did not exchange broad apologies. During the months of the legal process, my life had other small revolutions. I worked in the costume department, and slowly, without loud pronouncements, people began to notice me for my work. A director from an independent film asked me to do fitting for the lead actress on a passion project. It was the sort of job that builds reputation quietly. I accepted. She was small scale, but the film had a few people attached who mattered in the festival circuit. I did my job without acrimony. I made good choices about fabric and silhouette. The costume work gave me an income that was steady enough to be predictable. There is a red carpet at the end of this story, but the red carpet itself is not the point. The point is the accumulation of small choices that made that moment possible. Months after the mediated settlement, the independent film was accepted at a festival. It was not Cannes. It was a mid-tier festival in Los Angeles with a respectable press contingent. The lead actress invited the costume department to walk with her. That included me. I had learned to be careful about how I dressed in public. I had learned not to let my sister's jokes define me. I wanted to show up as myself. I wanted no stunt. On the day of the premiere, I chose the old thrift dress. Yeah, it was the dress my sister had laughed at. It was a simple silk with a slightly faded print, altered at the waist to fit. I put on modest jewelry, did my hair the way I always do for the theatre, and walked out. The press was waiting. Posing for photographers is like learning a language. You adopt the rhythm. When the lead actress and I reached the velvet rope, a familiar figure stepped forward. He was a designer. The one my sister often name-dropped when she wanted to remind people of her circle. He had been at earlier fundraisers, and He'd had lunch with my sister on more than one occasion, or at least the sort of lunch that gets Instagrammed. He paused as he reached me. He looked down at the dress. What happened next is not a melodrama. He bowed, a quick tilt of his head, not because he was performing for my sister or for the photographers, but because he recognized the work that went into the dress. He had been a costume designer in his early career. He understood careful alterations. He saw the invisible stitches that made the thrifted silk behave like custom fabric. He saw that the dress fit the way a good garment does, where the person emerges from the cloth rather than the cloth swallowing the person. His bow was a private acknowledgement in a public place. It surprised me because it was small and earnest. It wasn't the triumph of an underdog or the fall of the villain. It was simply recognition from someone who knew what to look for. The consequence was that a few photographers snapped a different kind of image. The reporters positioned themselves as curious rather than predatory. My sister did not appear in that photograph. She had sent a few messages earlier that day to the effect that she couldn't make it, that she had other obligations. I did not arrange for the absence. It was the way the night unfolded. After the premiere, a short press cycle began to notice costume details. A writer from a smaller magazine asked me how we sourced garments and why the film had consciously used thrifted pieces. I gave a careful answer about sustainability and character authenticity. The writer followed up with a profile of the costume team, which highlighted small budget ingenuity. A few weeks later, an independent designer reached out, wanting to collaborate on a capsule collection inspired by that same approach. None of this was an elaborate revenge. It wasn't a takeover or an arranged public humiliation. It was work acknowledged publicly. It was quiet validation. My sister continued her life. She continued to have a network. She continued to host fundraisers and to be photographed at charity galas. But in private, our relationship thawed. She wrote an email that was more factual than perfunctory, offering to help with outstanding medical bills and suggesting that we set up a schedule of visits for our mother. My response was practical. I asked for written confirmation of the settlement terms we'd agreed to through the mediator and suggested a neutral calendar for visits. She complied. The consequences of the legal action and the small professional success were practical. The liens were cleared. The household accounts were transparent. A neutral trustee took over certain disbursements so that neither of us could spend impulsively on the estate. We divided responsibilities in ways that fit our abilities. She handled the public-facing relationships. I handled the day-to-day logistics. We had to coexist because our mother's needs required it. There are unsatisfactory parts too. She did not offer an apology that fixed everything. She did not say she had been wrong in a way that absorbed the weight of what she had done. We did not reconcile in a way that made all the years away disappear. But there was a measure of accountability. The trust was restructured. The money was realigned. The old patterns lost some of their power. When people ask me what I learned, I give a small practical answer because that is the only honest one I can offer. I learned that small documents can change narratives. I learned that legal process is not vindictive, it is procedural. I learned that dignity is often the result of steady decisions, not grand gestures. And I learned that recognition sometimes comes from people who understand the craft, not from the ones who applause loudly. At the end of the red carpet season, the designer sent a brief note. It was not public praise. It said simply that he appreciated what the costume department had done. It thanked me for the work. There was no bowing in the message, only a professional acknowledgement. That acknowledgement mattered more than any viral photograph. We still go to family events. We still speak in practical tones about who will do what for our mother. We live in a shared orbit. Sometimes I hear her make a joke about my thrift dress. Sometimes I let it pass. I have no appetite for revenge now. I have an appetite for certainty. The settlement removed a daily anxiety. The small recognition of the costume community opened doors that allowed me to accept roles that paid better and offered steadier work. The money stabilized my credit. The house stayed in the family. When I think back to the laugh at the brunch, it no longer has the terrifying weight it once did. It was cruel, yes. It was intended to wound. But it was one laugh among many facts that followed: bank statements, subpoenas, afternoons in law offices, nights sewing hems by lamplight. The red carpet moment was not a gasp of triumph, but a soft nod from someone who understood what I did for a living. That nod did not erase the things she took. It simply acknowledged the work I had always done. So if there is one final image I keep, it is not the designer's bow. It is the kitchen table where I first spread the misdirected bank printout and felt a small spark of something practical take hold. It was not about being right. It was about doing the work to make right possible. If you like this story, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. Did anything in my story resonate with you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.